I believe we are now live. How you doing there? I'm hoping that's the case. I think that's the case. Uh, if you use this phrase, there's a phrase, you've heard it before. We've all heard it and probably all used it at one time or another. The phrase is practice what you preach. If you use that phrase, interestingly enough, among Christian people, I spent a lot of my life with Christian people. If you use that phrase, it's not unlikely that somebody will object. They'll object. And what they'll say is, hey, what are you expecting me to be perfect? Is that what you're expecting? You want me to be perfect or something? And I should probably say, first of all, it's not what I expect. That's not the issue. My expectations are actually of very little consequence. God's expectation, on the other hand, are pretty important. The issue is, what does God expect, right? And you know what? It seems pretty fair to say, I'm talking about based on God's word, it seems pretty fair to say that, yeah, yeah, he does expect us to, with his help, with God's help, to at least make the effort to practice what we preach. Now, again, please notice I'm using a phrase very intentionally, with God's help. With God's help, we should at least be trying. We should be at least making the effort to practice what we preach. For example, in the book of James, chapter 1, verse 22, we find these words. This is in the Bible. This is in the Bible text. It says, but don't just listen to God's word. You must do what it says. Otherwise, you're only fooling yourselves. So, in other words, be doers of the word, not just talking about it, be doers of, do what it says. In other words, for those of us who are believers, what it's saying there is practice what you preach. I'll say it again. This is a really important aspect of all of this. With God's help, we're talking about with God, with his help, practice what you preach. Jesus got after the religious leaders of his time a good bit. You probably know that already. Now, this isn't the only reason why. This isn't the only reason, but he did this in part. He got after them in part because they didn't practice what they preached. That was a big part of it. In Matthew chapter 23, we have the record of Jesus. He's teaching this crowd, and Jesus says to the crowd, this is in Matthew chapter 23, verses 2 and 3. He says, the teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So he endorsed these people and their role in the culture. He says, he goes on in verse 3, so practice and obey whatever they tell you. But then he adds this, but don't follow their example. For he says, this is in the text, for they don't practice what they teach. Yes, God does expect us, with his help, to make the effort to do what he tells us to do. He expects us to try to live the way that he calls us to live. He expects us to practice what we preach. And I'm bringing this up because if we determine before we've even tried, we haven't even given it an effort. If we determine before we tried, we can't do it. No, it's impossible. There's no real point in even trying to live God's way because we can't do it anyhow. Then we're sabotaging our efforts to live God's way. Again, before we even give it a try. As Christians, we want to have the attitude and the mindset that Jesus mentions in God's word, that with God, there are things that are possible that we could not do without God. There are possibilities with God's help. Again, this phrase, with God, with his help, with God's strength, living God's way becomes at least a possibility for us. It's at least possible. And so we're going to try, we're going to make the effort to practice what we preach.